I'd like to call the JLARC meeting to order. It is so good to see so many members during the summer. I did want everyone to know that Senator Locke has been trapped up in Canada by the flooding, which is particularly unfortunate since she's the one that had asked for our major study on education. But I believe she'll be coming in on Zoom. Are you there, Senator?
She has not joined yet.
Okay. Well, hopefully she'll be here in time for that report at least. Okay. Hal, you have comments?
Good morning, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and members of the Commission. I'm Hal Greer, the Staff Director of JLARC. Welcome to the July meeting of the Commission. After introductions of new staff and consideration of the Commission's remote participation and virtual policy, we'll spend most of the morning reporting on our findings from the review of the state's K-12 funding formula and responding to questions that you may have. Want to note then there's going to be an adjustment in the agenda. We're going to then hear from Virginia 529 on their annual status report. Then we'll go to VRS. We'll provide a brief VRS oversight report from a staff standpoint, and then you'll hear from the VRS leadership. Madam Chair, at this time I'd like to introduce the newest members of the JLARC staff. First, we have Martha Tyler. Martha?
You can't see me, but
Martha arrived at JLARC in early June after graduating from William & Mary with a BA in Government and Japanese Studies. Martha has been assigned to the Self-Sufficiency and Child Care Study Review. Also starting with us last month was Carrie Thompson. Carrie? Carrie received her BA in Global Affairs from George Mason University and recently received her Master of Public Policy from William & Mary. Carrie has been assigned to the Psychiatric Hospital Study. And then finally, Madam Chair, we have Madison McCaffrey, who started with us at the end of June. Madison? Madison received her BA from the University of North Carolina with majors in American History and American Studies, and recently received her Master in Public Policy from the UVA Baton School for Leadership and Public Policy. Madison's been assigned to the Attorney's Study.
Welcome to all of you. It's interesting to me that two of you have backgrounds in international relations. So do I. And somehow we have ended up here. Oh, yes, and the William & Mary connection, yes.
Madam Chair, I'd next like to present to the Commission for its consideration and approval a proposed remote participation in virtual meeting policy. We need to have one in place in order for members of the Commission to participate remotely. The draft policy follows the provisions and requirements of FOIA that allow for remote participation for virtual meetings. I'll briefly summarize the highlights and be happy to answer or try to answer any questions that you have about it. In terms of remote participation, the draft policy would allow members to participate remotely for the following 4 reasons. A member has a disability or medical condition that prevents attendance. A member is required to provide care to a family member with a medical condition that prevents attendance. A member is unable to attend due to a personal matter, or a member's residence is more than 60 miles from the meeting location. And please note that a member can only participate remotely due to a personal matter twice in a calendar year, and that's per statute. The other key provision of the proposed policy is that the Commission may have up to 2, but no more than 2 virtual meetings per calendar year. The policy is in your packet. Before turning over to you for consideration, I will note that this draft policy follows the statutory requirements. You could make it more restrictive, but you can't make it less restrictive per statute. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Commission.
Madam Chairman,
Yes.
I move to adopt the recommendation.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there discussion? Okay, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, we adopted the policy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And on to the next item on our agenda, which is a presentation of the findings from our review of Virginia's K-12 funding formula. What is being presented today is the culmination of an 18-month review that has been enormously complex and challenging. The team that was tasked with taking on this difficult review has fully delivered on the assignment, and as you'll hear today, we have a lot to report about the formula, which was last reviewed by JLARC more than 20 years ago. We've concluded that the formula needs to be significantly improved and modernized if the state is going to continue to use a staff-based formula. And the current formula calculates funding amounts that are far less than needed to sufficiently fund Virginia's school system. I'd like to thank Kent Dickey, the Deputy Superintendent for Budget, Finance, and Operations at the Department of Education, as well as Ed Lanza, the DOE Budget Office Director, for their assistance in conducting this review. I'll turn it over to Justin Brown, who oversaw this study and who has extensive experience working in K-12 during his tenure at JLARC. Justin?
Thank you, Al. Good morning, Madam Chair. Just 3 brief points before Mark gets started with his presentation. I think first to kind of set where we're coming from here. Some of our work is directed by you as members under study resolutions. In contrast, this was directed to us through a joint resolution that was passed by both the House and the Senate. And that study resolution consisted of a series of very specific items directing us to, for example, determine whether the SOQ formula accurately reflects prevailing practice in Virginia school divisions. Second, though our presentation this morning will be fairly long, we're actually not presenting all the information in our written report, and we're not presenting all the recommendations and options the report includes. The full report and all its recommendations and options will be on the JLARC website later today. Third and finally, we have worked really hard to give you cost estimates throughout the presentation this morning. These are our best estimates using the information we had as of now, but please be mindful that the exact dollar amounts, if you choose to implement any of these, are going to be at least slightly different, largely depending on when you decide to implement them. But we do feel confident in our estimates, though, especially to give you a very good idea of the relative order of magnitude of the costs associated with the changes included in the report. And given how much the state and localities collectively spend on K-12, over $20 billion in recent years, even relatively minor changes to this formula can result in fairly sizable cost impacts in terms of dollars. So with that, I'll introduce our chief analyst who led this project, Mark Cribben.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Good morning, members of the Commission. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge our study team, on this side. Sarah Bertie Sachs, Mitch Perry, and Sam Leeseman. I'd also like to thank the VDOE staff for all their assistance over the past year and a half, and educators from across the Commonwealth who took time to talk with us. Our study was directed by a joint resolution passed in the 2021 session. As Justin mentioned, the resolution directed a fairly broad review of how public education is currently funded in Virginia, with special focus on the Standards of Quality, or SOQ, funding formula. In brief, we found that Virginia school divisions receive less funding per student than divisions in other states. Divisions also receive less funding than Virginia-specific funding benchmarks. This largely stems from issues with the SOQ formula, which we found used inputs and assumptions that lacked clear rationale and did not reflect prevailing practices in school divisions. We also found the formula did not adequately account for higher needs students, regional labor cost differences, and division size. Those are the 3 things that drive cost differences across school divisions and are beyond school divisions' control. We found that the local composite index, which is the way the formula divides up state and local funding obligations, is old but remains a reasonably accurate measure of ability to pay. We also found that most other states use a different kind of funding formula. Most states use a simple student-based formula, whereas Virginia uses a more complex staffing-based formula. Throughout this briefing, I'll be presenting a number of recommendations and policy options. We've tried to focus on the major ones, and a full list can be found in the report. Because some of these would require more time to implement than others, we've divided them into the near and long term. The numbers we'll show today are the state funding impacts, that is, what the impact would be on the state budget if these had gone into place in fiscal '23. We should have estimates for division and local government level impacts on our website sometime this week. Moving on to our background discussion. A big picture, school divisions receive over $20 billion in funding from local, state, and federal governments. Locals accounted for slightly over half of funding, while the state provided 39%. That state-local split is tilted by a few large suburban school divisions where the locality provides a majority of the funding. For example, Fairfax County alone accounts for $2.5 billion of all local government funding. Looking at the state share of funding, 84% comes from the SOQs. The rest comes from about 40 different non-SOQ programs, mainly lottery and incentive programs. SOQ funding is, of course, determined by the SOQ formula. Conceptually, that formula follows a three-step process, which we've laid out here. Step 1, calculate how many staff are needed. Step 2, determine the cost of compensating those staff and the cost of everything else, such as buses, fuel, and utilities. The resulting amount is the total SOQ funding obligation. Step 3, determine the state and local shares of funding. This is done using the local composite index. And these three steps are carried out for every school division, resulting in unique state and local funding amounts for each division. Funding is, of course, essential for maintaining the quality of the public education system, and there are decades of research supporting this. For example, a recent metadata study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that a $1,000 increase in spending per student was associated with 2.3% higher graduation rates. Research also shows the most critical element of education quality is teacher quality, and sufficient funding is needed to recruit and retain good teachers. Although funding is a critical piece of education quality, funding alone does not ensure a high-quality education system. Other factors that influence student success include things that are within the system's control, such as the type of instruction and support services offered, as well as things that are outside of the system's control, such as how well students are supported at home. Madam Chair, as I go through, I'll pause for, if you want me to pause for you. If not, I'll just keep on going.
I think it would be helpful if you do pause. Thank you. Are there questions at this point? Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Next is the legal framework for Virginia's K-12 system. Looks like we lost, there it is. Virginia's Constitution directs the establishment of a high-quality system of free public education. The Constitution grants fairly wide latitude to determine what high quality means. It does not provide a specific definition, but instead, it directs the legislature and the Board of Education to establish the, quote, standards of quality. The legislature is also given wide latitude in determining how the system of public education is funded. Within the standards of quality, prior General Assemblies have said that the goal of the public education system is to, again, quote, enable each student to develop the skills that are necessary for success in school, preparation for life, and reaching their full potential. Past General Assemblies have also established the broad framework for the standards of quality, which extend beyond the SOQ formula to things like the standards of learning, the standards of accreditation, and graduation requirements. Past General Assemblies have also identified what is necessary for a high-quality education, and that list includes funding. Specifically, the code states that the quality of education depends on benefits and salaries necessary to ensure high-quality instructional personnel and the adequate commitment of other resources. Within the state's legal framework, we developed 6 criteria for evaluating the SOQ formula. Looking at the first 2 criteria, the formula should be based on 1, clear and justifiable rationale, and 2, the formula cost calculations should reflect prevailing practices. These criteria stem from the task force that created the formula and past Attorney General opinions on what the formula is legally required to do. And again, those are Attorney General opinions, not judicial opinions. The remaining criteria are those commonly used to assess state funding formulas. Madam Chair, I'll take another brief pause in case you have any questions. Thank you, Madam Chair. Next, we'll look at how total K-12 funding in Virginia compares to key benchmarks. Here we'll be looking at the total funding divisions receive from all sources, including state, local, and federal funds. There is no single best way to determine ideal K-12 funding levels, so we compared funding to several benchmarks. Benchmark comparisons are useful because they can help determine if funding is within a reasonable range. We benchmarked Virginia against other states and to 3 different Virginia-specific funding estimates of funding needs. Funding substantially above or below the benchmarks would indicate that that school divisions are receiving too much or too little funding, while funding close to the benchmarks would suggest it's about right. Again, for this analysis, we're looking at school division funding from all state, local, and federal sources, but we did limit the analysis to funding that goes towards K-12 operations, which excluded capital expenditures, debt service, and pre-K programs. We found that Virginia school divisions receive less funding per student than national and regional state averages. This slide shows you Virginia's actual funding per student compared to other state benchmarks. After adjusting for differences in cost of labor, we found the U.S. 50-state average was 14% higher than Virginia. We also compared Virginia to the other states in the South Atlantic Census region and found the regional average was 4% higher. We then compared Virginia directly to border states. We found that Virginia's per-student funding was higher than neighbors North Carolina and Tennessee, but trailed Kentucky, Maryland, and West Virginia. We also found that Virginia's school divisions receive less funding per student than what the 3 Virginia-specific benchmarks indicate may be needed. The 3 Virginia-specific funding estimates we developed are described here. The first one was called a cost function model. It estimated funding needs using statistical relationships between division spending and test outcomes. This is one of the methods that's commonly used to estimate K-12 funding needs in other states, and our model was constructed by the method's national expert with refinements made by our chief methodologist. The goal of the model was to estimate the amount of funding needed for all Virginia school divisions to achieve the 75th percentile nationally on standardized tests. The second method was the best practices method. For this one, we reviewed 31 K-12 studies or funding studies performed in other states and looked at what funding amounts they recommended were needed. We then converted the data so it was comparable across studies and applied the recommended funding amounts to Virginia. The last method was the workgroup method, which is the method most commonly used to estimate K-12 funding needs. In our version, we convened 7 work groups of more than 40 Virginia educators from across the state. Using a well-defined methodology, we had those groups estimate how many staff would be needed to provide students with a, quote, sufficient education. We then costed out those staffing assumptions. The funding models estimated Virginia school divisions need from 6 to 33% more funding, depending on the model used. The cost function estimate was the lowest, in large part because many Virginia school divisions already meet the model's target goal. That is, many divisions already scored in the 75th percentile nationally on standardized tests, so the model did not think that they needed any more money. The work group model was the highest estimate and pulled up the average for all the 3 methods. This was expected because this approach typically generates higher estimates than other methods, but we still regarded it as a reasonable approach. I think the key takeaway here is not necessarily how different the Virginia number is from any of the given benchmarks, but that Virginia lagged all of the benchmarks. Combined with the other states' comparison, the analysis strongly suggests that Virginia's K-12 funding could be improved. Here I want to shift the focus from all funding that divisions get to what the SOQ formula says they should get. We found that the SOQ formula calculations result in substantially less funding than either actual K-12 spending or the benchmarks. This slide shows you the differences. Actual funding was 61% higher than what the SOQs calculated, and the benchmark amounts were even higher. Putting this in dollar terms, the SOQ formula calculated divisions need $10.7 billion in K-12 funding from all sources. In reality, divisions spent $17.3 billion, or $6.6 billion more than what the formula thought was needed. In terms of how this plays out at the division level, it means wealthier localities are able to put in more funding above what the SOQ requires, while others are not. As a result, divisions in localities with a lower ability to pay tend to have less funding per student. When comparing the SOQ formula calculations to actual spending, it's reasonable to ask if the actual spending amount is being inflated by a few large and wealthy divisions spending more than what is really needed. If you look at the unadjusted per student spending, you'll see that it does look like divisions in wealthier urban and suburban areas, especially in Northern Virginia, are spending substantially more. However, once you adjust for differences in student needs and labor costs, those differences largely go away. While a few Northern Virginia and other suburban divisions remain among the top spenders, they no longer stand out as a group. In fact, we found that only 2 school divisions were spending substantially more per student than anyone else. Those were both very small divisions in different parts of the state, and the higher spending levels were to be expected given their small size. We want to be clear that the state has substantially increased funding for K-12 education in the previous and current budget years. By our calculations, the fiscal 23-24 budget includes an additional $1.2 billion in ongoing state funding. Those increases are not captured in our benchmarks because we don't have complete data for those years. Our work here included the most recent data available. When new data becomes available, it's possible Virginia could look better relative to benchmarks, but a lot of that depends on what has happened in other states and with local funding. For example, we know some states like Tennessee and Maryland have recently embarked on major reforms that include increased K-12 funding. On the local side, we simply don't know yet if Virginia local governments have increased their education funding commitments or by how much. There's also the effects of inflation, which have been at record highs and have likely or have offset many of the gains from the state funding increases. Madam Chair, I'll take another break in case there are questions.
Questions? Don't see any.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Next, we'll focus more directly on the issues we found with the SOQ formula. As I mentioned at the start, the SOQ formula relies heavily on 1, staffing calculations, and 2, cost assumptions, which are then applied to those staffing numbers. I'll cover both of those pieces in this section. Looking at staffing, we found that the SOQ staffing ratios and calculations were only partly based on clear and justifiable rationale. We also found they did not reflect prevailing practice and were not accurate and transparent. The formula relies mostly on fixed staffing ratios that are set in the Code and the Appropriation Act. For example, there are staffing ratios for teachers and all of the big non-teaching positions. All those ratios get plugged into the formula, and it calculates a number of staff that it thinks are needed. Similar to what we found with funding overall, the formula calculates far fewer staff than are actually employed by school divisions, with a difference of 51%. The difference between the SOQ calculations and what the work groups recommended was even larger at 90%. We identified similar differences across every position type. For teachers, who you can see on the top, the gap between the formula and actual practices was proportionally smaller than the gaps for the other positions. However, because there are a lot more teachers, once all the math is done, teachers accounted for 1/3 of the total position gap. The other position group I'd highlight here are teacher aides. Those are right below teachers on the left. When you look at the data, you can see a 677% gap between the number of aides the formula thinks are needed and what divisions actually employ. There are 2 reasons for this big gap. First, the formula only recognizes kindergarten and special education aides, and many of the division staff we talked to said they actually employ general aides in other grades, especially 1 through 5. Some division staff also said the formula's numbers for kindergarten and special education aides were too low. To address some of the more minor staffing issues, we recommend including some positions that are not currently SOQ recognized into the formula, as well as some cost-related technical fixes. But to address the meat of the staffing calculation issue, we recommend the state develop a new comprehensive set of staffing ratios that more accurately reflect how divisions are currently staffed. If you've had a chance to read our report, you've noticed that this recommendation is the one with the biggest funding impact. That's because of the sizable effect that staffing calculations have in the formula. This change would be a big lift to implement, not just from a funding perspective, but also a technical perspective. New data-based ratios would need to be developed in cooperation with the Board of Education and school divisions, and VDOE's IT application, which performs the SOQ calculations, would need to be heavily modified or replaced. For those reasons, we've characterized this as a long-term recommendation, which the state could try and implement over the next 10 years. Looking at the other formula calculations and cost assumptions, we found that these only partly met or failed to meet our criteria. The areas of concern here were some Great Recession formula changes, the way the formula calculates prevailing salaries, the way those salary assumptions are updated, and the state's method for increasing compensation funding. First on the list, following the Great Recession, there were a number of formula changes made to reduce funding in response to steep revenue declines. This was, of course, perfectly understandable. The state could not provide divisions with funding that it didn't have. Looking back, many of these changes continue to have clear policy merit. However, based on the 6 criteria I mentioned at the beginning, it looked like 3 changes have partial or no continuing merit and do not reflect prevailing practice. I'm sure you've all heard of the support cap. Changes were made last session to change the cap to a set staffing ratio, but in our assessment, the new ratio continues to function as a cap on prevailing costs, and so by definition reduces funding below what is prevailing. We also looked at how the cap affects funding currently and historically. The bottom line is that it seems to be an ineffective way of limiting support staff funding, and in practice likely reduces some instructional funding. Looking at other changes, several non-personal costs like travel and lease costs were removed from the formula calculations, even though divisions still incur them, and also the formula now uses less accurate federal funding assumptions. To address those points, we recommend the state eliminate the support cap, reinstate the non-personal costs that were removed, and return to the previous federal funding deduction approach. Now we'll switch over to how funding for employee salaries and compensation is determined. First, I'd like to point out that it is ultimately the divisions, not the state or the SOQ formula, that determine what salaries are actually paid. The state and the formula simply provide one of the major sources of funding. The formula determines funding, making a number of salary assumptions, but again, those are not the actual salaries that are paid. Also, while we did discuss the adequacy of compensation funding with school divisions, we did not try and determine if their salaries were competitive. Likewise, we didn't go into any in-depth analysis of pay practices at divisions, such as the use of pay scales or merit pay. One of the key steps in determining funding for salaries and all salary-related compensation is the calculation of the prevailing salary for a given position. The way the state determines prevailing salary is through a valid but little used statistical method called the linear weighted average. This graphic shows how that calculation works. So each of the dots shown here represents the average salary paid by each Virginia school division for an elementary school teacher. They go from the lowest on the, let me see if I get this right, lowest on the left to the highest on the right. I hope that's probably reverse of what you're seeing. For example, the lowest salary on the left is below $40,000 and the highest on the right is over $80,000. The formula takes all the division salaries and weights the ones in the middle more, which is why we have this pyramid shape, and also weights the lowest and highest salaries less. So when the prevailing salary is calculated, the salaries in the middle count more than the salaries on the ends. If that's not easy to follow, trust me, you're not alone. It took us a while to grasp this one. The issue we found with this approach is that it tends to underweight the state's largest school divisions. These bubbles represent division size. The bigger the bubble, the bigger the school division. And as you can see, the largest school divisions tend to be weighted less. In fact, 62% of elementary teachers work at a division that is assigned a low weight in the salary assumption calculation. These tend to be urban and suburban divisions in higher cost areas where higher salaries are needed to compete for employees. Meanwhile, small and mid-sized divisions are weighted more. These divisions tend to be more rural and lower cost, or in more rural and lower cost areas where salaries can be lower. These divisions employ far fewer staff than their lower weighted counterparts in the big divisions. For example, they account for only 29% of elementary teachers. So the upshot here is that a majority of K-12 staff are at the larger divisions, and the formula systematically underestimates the cost of paying those staff. We recommend the state change how prevailing costs are calculated by using a straight division average, where all divisions are given equal weight instead of the linear weighted average. The formula also often uses out-of-date cost assumptions for salaries. SOQ costs are recalculated every 2 years for the biennial budget under a process called rebenchmarking. The cost data that feeds into the formula is itself 2 years old and so needs to be adjusted to reflect current costs. Unlike other cost assumptions, the salary assumptions are not always fully updated, and adjustments have not kept pace with actual salary growth. You can see that in the graphic here. The dark bar on the left is the salary adjustment that's made in the formula, and the lighter bar on the right is the actual growth in teacher salaries. There are only 3 biennia, and I don't know if you can see that highlighted on the bottom, where the formula adjustment was equal or greater than the actual salary growth experienced. The other piece of salary adjustments is how salaries and related compensation are increased above the prevailing level. As you all know, the way the state does this is by passing a compensation supplement in the budget. While supplements have recently been provided in every year, historically that has not been the case. Additionally, even when supplements are provided, the amounts are not necessarily based on a clear measure or objective. This in turn affects growth in the actual salaries paid by school divisions. When we go back and look at the data, it shows that average Virginia teacher salary has consistently trailed the statutory goal of being at or above the national average. Of course, when making decisions on whether to pass a compensation supplement and what the amount of that supplement should be, the state must balance that need with its other budget priorities and constraints. Our recommendation is to first take care of the salary cost assumption issue. The state could do this by routinely updating the salary assumptions that are used in the formula. That way, they will more closely reflect current actual salaries when the formula cranks its calculations. Second, as a policy option, the state could develop and implement a funding plan for compensation supplements. The idea here is that if the plan is followed, the state would eventually achieve the statutory goal of paying teacher salaries at or above the national average. Madam Chair, once again, I'll pause for your direction.
Questions?
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. Next, we'll talk about how the formula accounts for costs that drive differences in division funding needs. There are 3 main cost drivers for school divisions that are outside of their control. The first is the number of higher needs students a division has. Higher needs students include at-risk, low-income students, special education students, and English language learners. Research shows that each of these groups needs additional instruction and support services to achieve the same outcomes as peers. The second cost driver is regional labor costs. Simply put, in some parts of the state, you have to pay more to compete for employees. The third driver is division size, as measured by the number of students. Specifically, small school divisions are less able to achieve economies of scale. We'll look at higher needs students first. Here we found that state funding per student has increased for at-risk students and English learners, but has actually declined on a per-student basis for special education. We also found that state funding for all higher needs student groups is lower than benchmarks. So looking at state funding, and again here we are just looking at the money that the state provides. You can see per student funding for English learners increased 23% and at-risk increased by 46%. Meanwhile, per student funding for special education has declined by 16%, and the base year here being fiscal 13, so the past 10 years. State funding for special education has declined per student because the number of special education students has grown, but total funding for those students has been relatively flat. Although state special education funding has not kept pace with the growing student population, the data indicate local governments have been making up the difference. From fiscal 13 to 21, divisions reported their actual special education spending increased 17% per student. Seeing as that additional funding is not coming from the state or federal government, we have to assume that it's coming from the local coffers. We also compared state funding for higher needs students to benchmarks and found state funding was below most benchmarks. Unlike the benchmarks we showed you earlier, these do reflect the state's fiscal 23 budgeted amounts, including recent increases for at-risk students and English learners. I'll pause and point out the middle graphic for special education. You can see that for this group, the difference between Virginia and the benchmarks was fairly consistent. Given what we found in our analysis, we think changes are needed to the formula's special education calculations. However, the current calculations and ratios are extremely complicated and so defy any simple changes. We think new staffing ratios would have to be developed. To do that, the state needs to collect additional division-level data on special education staffing practices, and we recommend tasking VDOE with accomplishing this in consultation with school divisions and outside experts. Now we'll shift our focus to at-risk funding. The research shows that additional instruction and support services are essential for low-income students to succeed. The need for these services goes up in school divisions with high concentrations of poverty. Even though at-risk funding is critical, only 32% of at-risk money is required under the SOQs. Additionally, the way the state's two largest at-risk programs are structured, they do not provide a consistent amount of additional funding for every at-risk student. For example, under the largest at-risk program, one division received less than $300 per student, while another received almost $2,000 per student. A second issue with the at-risk programs is with the data used to determine funding. Several programs use free lunch rates to do this. However, because of a 2014 federal initiative, many schools and divisions have stopped collecting free lunch applications. For those schools and divisions, the state at-risk programs use free lunch data from the last year that applications were collected. Now, what this chart shows is how the free lunch rates used for funding compare to the rates used in the nutrition program. The bottom line is that the rates being used for funding are increasingly inaccurate because a lot of the rates are frozen in time. As a result, some high poverty divisions are likely losing out on funding because they've experienced increasing rates of poverty. Our first recommendation for the at-risk programs is to designate the largest program, the at-risk add-on, as SOQ required. This would recognize the essential nature of these funds. Next, we recommend the state adopt a new data source for determining at-risk funding. Instead of using outdated application data, it should use another free lunch program data point called the identified student percentage. This percentage is uniformly calculated for all divisions and can be weighted to approximate free lunch rates. Additionally, the state should consolidate its two largest at-risk programs into a single SOQ required program. The new program should use a formula that better balances funding to divisions with different student poverty levels. Now we'll shift to our second cost driver, which is cost of labor. We found that the formula's cost of competing adjustment uses old data and excludes several divisions. The current cost of competing adjustment, or COCA, consists of a few flat percentage adjustments that were developed in 1995 based on 1991 data and have remained virtually unchanged since. There was limited data available when those percentages were calculated, so while they were a decent measure of regional cost differences, they were also somewhat imprecise. Regional labor costs have changed over the 30 years since the COCA percentages were developed, and newer and better data is now available. Here you can see the differences, or I hope you can see the differences, between the COCA and regional labor costs. The blue bars show what the added labor costs are for the divisions that receive the full COCA according to a current labor cost index, and that lighter dotted line is the flat COCA percentage that those divisions actually receive for instructional staff. As you can see, in every case, the index cost of labor appears to be much higher than what the COCA provides. The second part of the chart shows how this plays out for those divisions that receive a partial COCA adjustment. Again, in all but a couple cases, the COCA is well below the index. The other issue with the COCA is that it only applies to Northern Virginia school divisions. While these divisions do tend to have the highest labor cost in the state, some divisions in other regions also have above average costs. Those are mostly in Central Virginia and Tidewater, and we have a map that shows all of these divisions in our report. We recommend the state replace the COCA with a more accurate adjustment based on a cost of labor index, and apply the adjustment to all divisions with above average costs. To be clear, one of the differences there is not everybody would get the same adjustment. It would be based on what the index says each division's additional cost of labor would be. So some would be higher, some would be lower. Our third cost driver was division size. Here we found the formula does not account for the economy of scale challenges faced by small school divisions. The academic research indicates that school divisions, like other organizations, benefit from economies of scale. In practice, this means that larger divisions are able to operate much more efficiently than small divisions, with a division size of about 2,000 students being an approximate tipping point. We found this did indeed play out in the Virginia data, where small divisions had 20 staff per students, while large divisions had 16 staff per 100. 20 staff per 100 versus 16 per 100. Using a formula developed by education researchers, we charted how much more funding Virginia school divisions might need based on their size. Looking to the left side of this graph, you can see that divisions with under 2,000 students are expected to have rapidly increasing costs. The current SOQ formula does not directly account for the higher operating costs of small school divisions, so we recommend adding an economies of scale adjustment for divisions with fewer than 2,000 students. Madam Chair, once again, I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
I'm sorry, I'm editorializing back here. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The next section looks at how state and local shares of SOQ funding are determined. As a reminder, this is the last step in the SOQ formula. At this point, the total SOQ funding obligation has been calculated. It just needs to be divided into the state and local shares. This is done using the Local Composite Index, or LCI. The LCI is a measure of each locality's ability to contribute funding. Generally, wealthier localities have a higher LCI and must contribute more, and less wealthy localities have a lower LCI and the state picks up more of the tab. We found that the Local Composite Index was based on clear and justifiable rationale and generally treated divisions fairly. However, there were some issues with accuracy, predictability, and transparency. The way the LCI measures ability to pay is by looking at how big the local tax base is relative to the state as a whole. The LCI was developed in the 1970s and is basically unchanged. It assumes that 50% of the local tax base is real estate and public service property, 10% is retail sales, and 40% is all other locally taxable property and commercial activity. Because things like car values were difficult to estimate when the LCI was developed, it uses adjusted gross income as a proxy measure for personal property and other tax bases. Flash forward to today, and you can see that the LCI is not that far out of line with the current actual local tax bases. We met with school divisions from across the state and found that the LCI was generally accepted. However, there were a few divisions that had significant concerns about the LCI. When we looked into those concerns, most appear to be unfounded. Namely, LCI calculations do not include tax-exempt properties, although that is not always clear in VDOE's materials. LCI does not appear to be skewed by one or a few wealthy individuals. For example, if a county has a billionaire move in, there does not appear to be much effect on the LCI. LCI does not account for local or differences in local land use policies. This is something that some localities would like to see changed, but from a policy perspective, the point of the LCI is to provide an objective measure of ability to pay. The LCI should not provide divisions with more or less state funding based on local tax decisions. One local concern that did have merit is the LCI can result in sudden large losses of state funding if a locality experiences a certain combination of trends. While this only occasionally happens to a few localities, it does create unexpected budget challenges for both the locality and its school division. For example, the most recent LCI recalculation resulted in Greensville County losing 15% of state funding and Richmond City losing 5%. We recommend the state address the volatility issue with the LCI by using 3-year averages of the most recently available data instead of just the most recent single year. For example, that would mean using an average of the last 3 years of true property values. This would help smooth out any sudden jumps. Madam Chair, we're almost to the end, but I'm happy to take a break.
Are there questions? We're either overwhelmed or totally impressed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our last section is on how the formula is used and options for wholesale design changes. On that first point, we found that a big reason the SOQ formula doesn't reflect prevailing practice is because it's sometimes changed to reflect budget decisions. Again, as you all know, the SOQ formula is often revised during the budget process. In practice, this means that some funding calculations end up being based on budget priorities and not an objective assessment of funding needs. Ideally, the formula should provide an accurate picture of funding needs that can guide budget decisions while leaving it to the General Assembly to determine what funding amounts can realistically be accommodated in the budget. Under this ideal approach, the SOQ formula would first estimate funding needs, and the legislature would then appropriate an amount above, below, or equal to what the formula estimates. Separating the formula from the budget would have several benefits. The General Assembly would have a more accurate estimate of funding needs to use in budget development because it would be easier to update the formula and keep those calculations accurate. The General Assembly would also have more flexibility in determining how much funding to provide within the budget's constraints. There would be no need to model or guess at the fiscal impact of different formula changes, such as changing a staffing ratio. This approach is not entirely novel. It has been used in some other states. And this is the recommendation that would implement that change. Madam Chair, we've spent all morning talking about the problems we found with the SOQ formula, but if you want to just forget about all of that, we came up with an easy out. Namely, Virginia could replace the current cumbersome and troublesome approach for something much more straightforward. As you can see here, Virginia is one of just a few states that uses a staffing-based model. Most states use a student-based model. A student-based model skips calculating how many staff are needed and what those staff cost, and jumps right to the cost per student. This greatly simplifies the funding calculations. A well-designed student model would have a lot of advantages over our current one. As I mentioned, it's much simpler, so it's easier to understand, manage, and change. You don't need a complicated.
Senator Sproul has a question.
Question, if you use a student model, then what happens if the staffing is short? How can you determine as far as the staffing? If you use a student model, then you got the staffing. What happens with the staffing if they fall short of? You follow what I'm trying to say?
Yes, Senator. Senator Sproul, if we went to a staffing model, that would be for funding purposes. The option would be on the table to keep those staffing ratios for compliance purposes. But you would be separating the staffing ratio. You could still have staffing ratios to make sure that a school division had a certain amount of teachers per student for compliance purposes, but those would not affect the funding calculation anymore. A well-designed student model would have a lot of advantages over our current one. As I mentioned, it's much simpler. Okay, where were we? One of the advantages, you don't need a complicated IT system and 100 Excel sheets to run it, so the risk of error is greatly reduced. It's easier to designate funding for specific purposes, such as special education. Additionally, the funding amounts that are provided for each purpose are much more transparent. It can also be more accurate because the calculations can be tied directly to actual prevailing costs. We developed a couple of options for the state to consider if it decides that now is the time to switch. The partial replacement option would get rid of the current special education and English learner calculations and replace them with student-based calculations. This is similar to what we've already recommended for at-risk funding. The full replacement option would be to get rid of the current formula and institute an entirely new student-based formula, similar to what our neighbors in Tennessee are currently doing. If the state decides to pursue either of these options, we've already done a lot of legwork on how they could be designed. Madam Chair, that concludes my briefing, so this would be the last chance for further questions.
Madam Chair.
Is it Senator McPike?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Looking briefly to the full report on pages Romanettes 8 through 9, it appears, if I do a summary of the number of recommendations, that there's roughly $2.5 to $3 billion worth of recommendations and needs. Is that about right?
I think when I added them up the other day, it was 3.5.
I missed $1 billion.
But I will trust your math. One thing I'll note there is that if all of these are implemented, there is a compounding effect. So when we ran the numbers, it was higher than that, about $4 billion. But again, that would assuming you would implement this all at once, which is not what we are recommending.
Thank you for that.
Senator McPike.
Yeah, Madam Chair, this is more the commentary. This is a lot of data and a lot of information, which is, I think, why you have a lot of pause and people digesting the information. As someone with kids in schools, it's pretty apparent over the 20 years I've had kids in schools on the direct impacts of classroom sizes. Most of my kids went through every year that had 30 kids per one teacher, and many other impacts over decades. And so this report's not surprising to this parent. I appreciate your work.
Any further questions? Yes, Delegate McKnight.
I'll just make an observation or two, and I'm just mostly going to speak to the money part of this. And overall in this report, I think your numbers kind of follow my numbers. It recommends about $3.5 billion in extra spending. So I acknowledge the $3.5 billion. And we also acknowledge these recommendations are costly and probably can't be implemented at once, had to be implemented over a little bit of time. The report, I believe, goes through probably 22. The chairman of JLARC and the chairman of Senate Finance, we, along collectively with all of us, we put in about $3.2 billion over the last couple of years, and I don't think that's accounted for in here. And we also at the chairman's, I concur, but at her initiative, she wants to put in hundreds of millions of more dollars, and I concur with that, you know. So, and also, the at-risk and English learner funding, we've made significant improvements on that. I'll also point out, Virginia school divisions still have $1.5 billion in federal COVID funds that they've got to spend before September 2024. And she and I, that's a big concern of ours. I know collectively that that money has to go back if we don't spend it. So we want to really make sure that we spend it. And sometimes, I'll throw a little stat out here, sometimes throwing money doesn't always solve the problem, because Richmond City Schools spends about $20,640 per student, and Henrico spends about $12,342 a student. So it doesn't always calculate to money, but I think that we have done a real good job with what resources we've had. We recognize that we have more resources, and we're both in concurrence that we want to put hundreds of millions of more dollars in there that may get us a whole lot closer to getting whole.
Madam Chair,
Senator Sproul.
with that extra money that he is talking about that has to be spent by September of 2024, to keep from just throwing money to somebody, have we determined yet where that money is needed and where it should go?
Senator, we did not look at how the federal funding should be spent. Again, that was, as has been mentioned, that's one-time funding. Our task was to look at the ongoing funding that school divisions receive. Certainly, a number of folks mentioned that they are using that money, and they're using it for purposes that they don't have replacement money for when it goes away. But that was all anecdotal from what we've heard from the divisions.
Well, let me direct the question to someone, to Janet Howard, to Delegate Bird Knight. Keep from losing that money in September 2024. Keep from just throwing it out there to make sure that we spend the money, have we determined where it should go in the rightful manner.
Just to respond briefly, yes, we're working on that. That's part of why we're not spending it quickly. We've got various work groups looking at the best places to put it. And frankly, I think this is very helpful. This study will be, Cuddy's my, yeah. But this, I think, is a very important study. And in fact, I would advise all candidates, not just for the General Assembly, but also for school boards and county boards, to read this study and be informed about it and grapple with the implications. Yes, Senator Norman. No, that's fine. I was finished.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm interested. We have two professional long-term educators on this body, and I certainly would be interested in their reflections on what they see. Secondly, I know one of the things we've talked about in higher education is the projection of birth rates. And we do know, based upon the analysis, that we're about to see a precipitous decline in the number of school-age kids. And obviously, if there's a decline in the number of college age young people coming through, there must be earlier children that are declining. And one of the concerns that I would have is making a dramatic adjustment on the infusion of income based upon numbers that we have today. And we build that infrastructure, we build that personnel structure. There is no way that divisions are going to cut back substantially once those numbers of declining students appear. What do we do about that from a formulary basis?
Senator Norman, it's a very good, I'm assuming that was a question for me, sorry. Your point is a good one. We saw that with the pandemic, when we lost about 3% of students dropped out of public schools. We saw that suddenly Virginia's, and those are the numbers that we have in our benchmarks, they looked a lot better than they did the year before, because there was essentially a 3% funding per student bump. So in terms of how that gets navigated in the future, the way the formula is designed considers the number of students both in the current formula as well as if we switch to a student-based formula. So that would theoretically track up or down depending on what happens with the number of students. To the infrastructure piece, that would be beyond what we looked at.
Well, even though I'm limping into the sunset, I still have one or two questions.
Are there further questions? Well, thank you. Very
Madam Chair.
impressive. Very impressive effort. Okay, Hal, the BRS report.
Yes, Madam Chair, we're going to switch it up per request and do 529 first. So next, we're going to shift gears and go into our ongoing oversight for the rest of this meeting. And first up will be Virginia 529, which they'll provide their annual status report.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Good morning.
Chairman, members of the commission. If I could take 2 seconds while we shift over on computers and get started. So it is nice as always to see all of you today. Thank you for giving us some time. And we decided to change it up a little bit. We knew you were going to have a data-heavy morning with the SOQ presentation. And given that we are in an off year in terms of the JLARC review, going to take a little bit different approach today and tell you a little bit of the why of Virginia 529. So if you go to the first slide, just a reminder, we have grown obviously a lot in the almost 30 years since the General Assembly first created us in 1994 with just education savings, and in fact, the prepaid 529 program. We now have a number of education savings programs. We added disability savings programs in 2015. We now have 2 of the largest programs of that type in the country. A retirement savings program. I was asked to give an update on that. The good update is that we were tasked by the General Assembly with opening a new work-based retirement savings option for Virginia workers to open by July 1 of 2023, and we opened on June 20th, 2023. We were open in pilot from February. And then SOAR Virginia, our access and affordability initiatives, you've heard a lot about those in recent years, and that's sort of the 4th pillar of what we do, a part of our original mandate. But rather than talking through things, I'm going to move on to the next slide. I really only have 2 slides in my deck today. Wanted to provide a video, about 5 minutes. We were given 10 minutes total. I said, be quick, this is a heavy schedule. And so we thought, well, what can we do? And break it up. And so you're going to hear from our customers today. You're going to hear a little bit about the why of Virginia 529, why we do what we do, and about the hundreds of thousands of Virginians, the millions of Virginians that we've helped over the last 30 years. So Scott, if you'll cue that up, it's about a 5-minute video that I hope you will enjoy.
Good.
It's important for families to use Invest 529 because you don't know what's down the road.
As a single parent, I knew I wanted to invest in their education.
I have 2 different children, different personalities, different career paths, and different education goals to get them on those career paths.
Saving through Invest 529 was much more appealing than saving through a regular savings account because the return on investment was higher. Also, you get the tax savings that you don't get with a regular savings account.
Simple process to open the account, simple avenues to save money, and then finally, when it comes time to make your distributions, it's a simple process to transfer money.
There's so many different avenues that kids can take, so I think that the 529 programs can help pay for whatever a child's dream may happen to be.
It makes me very proud to see that my children have chosen their career paths, and that I thought 18 years ago to begin to save for them and help them achieve that.
Able Now is available, I wasn't able to save in order to keep the services and supports that I need for health and independent living.
My wife and I opened an Able Now account for our son Michael, who is 6 months old and has Down syndrome. And we know that having this account lets us start saving now for a lot of those future needs.
I opened my Able Now account because I felt that it would give me flexibility both financially and then also give me a tool to help pay for some of the many expenses that I deal with as an individual with a disability.
Once we found out about Able Now, it was kind of a no-brainer. We know that Michael was going to need the money later on in life, so why not start now?
I am empowered for my future because I can save money now.
Able accounts mean that people with disabilities can have savings accounts just like anyone else.
We received an email about RetirePath offering us the option to enroll for our staff. After we discussed it, we really felt like it was a no-brainer for us. This was a free option for the business to be able to provide resources for our staff.
I was very excited when I heard about this. I had been thinking about starting a Roth IRA on my own, but that was kind of a lot to do. So when I found there was a way for them to just quick do it for me, I signed up right away.
I was interested in RetirePath because at my age, I haven't really made the proper arrangements for post-career life. So it was a welcome opportunity for me to start a plan.
I love working here, and having the retirement program really just brings me so much peace of mind.
Well in your future endeavors, and everything that you touch, I hope it turns to gold.
We are here to celebrate each of you. There are over 2,000 of you going to college.
This is such an inspirational day, and I'm so happy to be here to celebrate you going to college. Who's going to college?
So that's a little bit about Virginia 529 and some of the families that we're helping. On the next slide, we've got some facts and figures. I am happy to stay here all day and talk to you all about each of our programs, answer any questions that you have. You will note that you have a lot in the appendices with information about performance. Mike Swink, our investment director, is here if you have questions on that. I would say we've had a good year. It's been a volatile up and down year, but I think we're doing fine. We continue to grow accounts. The industry has seen a shrinking in year-over-year account growth. We've seen some of that, but in a much lower rate than other states, and we continue to be, I would say, a market leader. We have the largest, by far, 529 program in the country. As I said, ABLE has about 10% of the national market. We are beyond excited about RetirePath. And what we're doing in access and affordability, I think, is huge. Again, you've heard a lot about that. We've talked about that during the session. I'm pleased to say that several of you are working with us on a legislative work group that we think will help us advance some of those initiatives and look at handling the defined benefit 529 program, the assets within it. That's been a subject of study by JLARC. There's information in the appendices on all of that. And I'll also say on the final slide are all the links to our programs to find us on our website, on Facebook, on Twitter, and everywhere else. Full-length videos like that are throughout our website. So those are testimonials, things that we've used over a number of years with our customers. We did 4 of the videos for the RetirePath that we'll be using across the state as we bring this program out to the businesses that are eligible, that are required to participate. We have gotten really strong, favorable reactions. And those 4 videos, if you watch, each one is about 2 minutes. They're on the Retire Path Virginia website, and I think they're terrific. They are really inspiring, and I think it tells you the story of why we are so appreciative that the General Assembly supported those efforts, as you have supported all of our efforts over the last 30 years to help people with their education savings, with saving for disabilities, with saving for retirement, and we are rebranding over the next couple of years as we will hope to change our agency name next legislative session. That was in our legislation this year as well, to really look at ourselves as a financial services organization that helps all Virginians on their path to financial health and wellness with some very specific tax advantage programs to help them in those 3 areas that we know are the ones that are most important to families, not just in Virginia, but around the country: saving for retirement, saving for education, and saving for disabilities. So with that.
Are there questions? Yes. Tell me about it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a question. You were mentioning a legislative work group, and I was looking at your timeline, and you have a legislative ad hoc working group, and there's like 10 members. Who appointed those members?
Yes, ma'am. Well, we asked. No one appointed them. We asked a number of members. We based that request on what came out of Senate Finance during the last session. So we had legislation in both the House and the Senate. The one failed to be reported out of the House. It was reported out of Senate Finance with a recommendation that there be a reenactment clause, that there be a legislative work group. There was also a budget amendment that would have created something like that, but since the budget is still in flux, we wanted to get input. So we went to members who had been engaged, members of the committees of reference. So we asked members of Senate Finance, Senate Education, House Finance, House Education, if they would participate. We also informed the chairman that we were making those requests. So it was just some people from those committees that we had, again, often worked with over the session, who had been involved and engaged with us.
Do you want to say something to me too?
So.
You want to do it?
Yeah, I was just going to comment that, I've been here for 26 years. The chair's been a lot longer, but unless she was asked, you don't have the authority to make those kind of appointments, so they don't really have the authority to come out with a report for the legislative body.
Sure. No, the report will be ours. And again, in the budget amendment, and if there should still be a budget, then we would go back to the chairs. We did note to all the committee chairmen that we were making this request. It's, as we call it, an ad hoc. It is informal, but it's an attempt to get some legislative input into what we're doing to answer the questions that we had during the session with the legislation that we had. There were a lot of questions on the amounts of money that might be available, the programs that we were looking to participate in, what we might do with respect to prepaid customers. And so we understand that it is informal, but it's a way to meet as a group rather than trying to meet with each individual one-on-one and get the information across to members of the legislature.
Madam Chair?
Senator Sproul.
She haven't answered the question. I understand what she is saying. It's nice. The question was the members who are appointed. She haven't answered the question. That your committee, do you appoint those 10 folks based on knowledge? Do the members of the General Assembly, do they appoint them? So the question is this: what's needed, what's been done? I understand all of that. But I'm trying to get you the question that she asked the question. Do you have the authority to appoint the members?
No.
I guess I don't consider it an appointment. We asked some members of the General Assembly if they would assist us in listening and giving us their feedback.
Thank you.
So it is informal. They won't have any kind of formal report. There's, again, we were just trying to find a way to keep moving forward with the initiatives that we're trying to move forward on. We know during the session it's very difficult to get the time, and so this was our way of, again, assembling a bipartisan group.
But do you have the authority to do it?
I think it's pretty clear that it's unauthorized and will be treated as such.
Yeah, I
Madam
don't think it
Chair,
has any formal
the only thing is,
recommendations.
whether it's unauthorized or authorized, the members, really, anyone then could create their own ad hoc committees and have elected officials serving on it, and it has implications that can go along with that. It's nothing about what your project is or someone else's project is. It's just something that the speaker makes appointments, all those, there's a process for that, and it's done for a particular reason to protect the public's interest for everyone involved. So I would say that the committee really is not authorized and it should not meet.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Any further? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, next we'll turn to VRS, and first, Jamie Bitts from our staff will present our semi-annual VRS oversight report. Jamie?
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. As Hal said, my name is Jamie Bitts, and I'll give you a very brief version of our semi-annual report on VRS. This slide just shows you the mandate for our continuing oversight. And I'll start by talking about the trust fund's investments and their recent performance. Now, as you probably know, the financial assets used to pay VRS benefits are pooled in its trust fund, and a core responsibility of VRS is managing the investment of those assets. The trust fund had a return of negative 1.8% for the one-year period ending on March 31st. But it did exceed its benchmarks for all of the periods shown here on slide 5. Total assets in the trust fund declined slightly to $102.6 billion for that year ending March 31st, but the decline would have been much larger had VRS not exceeded those benchmarks. It's also worth pointing out that the total returns for all but the one-year period were above that 6.75% long-term rate of return assumption that the VRS board makes. And I should also mention that based on more recent numbers through April 30th, the total fund had a positive return of 1.7% for the one-year period. That's not shown on the slide, but it is more updated data. And again, that 1.7% positive return was above the benchmark. This slide just shows you a breakdown of returns for the different asset classes, and you can see that VRS exceeded all but 2 of its benchmarks across the various asset classes. And I'll take just a couple of minutes to talk about VRS's defined contribution plans. VRS manages defined contribution plans for state and local employees, and those plan assets are completely separate from the VRS trust fund. In total, the defined contribution plans had about $7.5 billion in assets as of March 31st. Now, in terms of their performance, the returns for the majority of defined contribution options exceeded their benchmarks. In fact, all of the options exceeded the benchmarks for the 3, 5, and 10-year periods, and it was just one plan for the one-year period that missed its benchmark. And finally, Madam Chair, I'll talk for just a moment about recent legislation related to VRS. As you may recall, last year's Appropriation Act included $750 million in general funds to further reduce the unfunded liabilities of the retirement plans. And the budget that was passed recently, the so-called skinny budget, passed a couple of months ago, did include an additional $250 million for that purpose. That makes a total of $1 billion for the FY22-23 biennium to reduce unfunded liabilities. There were also several pieces of legislation passed by the 2023 General Assembly that related to VRS, and in particular reduced the break in service for retirees in certain K-12 positions. These include school security officers as well as bus drivers in other K-12 positions. Reducing that break in service essentially makes it easier for retirees to return to work while still collecting their pension benefits. And finally, there was also legislation to increase the retiree health insurance credit that's provided. Madam Chair, that's a very brief set of slides, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions there may be.
Questions? Oh, Delegate Knight.
I was looking in there, and I'm sure you've got a simple answer for it. And you've got categories where you invest your money. And there was one, if I recall, that was getting like 2.9%. It's about 3 or 4 columns down. It looked like it had been underperforming for many, many, many years. I understand it not anomaly of the last year or two, but I didn't know what category that was in. And I don't even know if you can recall it because I can't find it right this second. But it's, I don't know if that was something you kept in cash for something we needed or what, but it looked like it was an underperforming asset in a certain category. Do you recall what I'm talking about?
Not off the top of my head. I'm looking at, there is a very detailed slide in the appendix at the end of the presentation where that figure may appear. And if we can't find it here, I could certainly get back to you and provide more information.
Further questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I will now introduce Mr. A. Scott Andrews, who is the chair of the VRS Board of Trustees.
1 year's negative, 10 years is 2.
Mr. Andrews.
Good morning, Madam Chair. How are you?
Welcome. Good.
Thank you and all the members of the commission. This is my second time in front of you, and I appreciate the opportunity to introduce Andrew and Trish for more detailed reports. So I'm Scott Andrews, Chair of the Board of Trustees, and I'm delighted to be here today. Joining me on the board are 8 other Virginians, including 2 appointed since our meeting last July. New board members include Lindsay Pantley, a teacher in the Henrico County Public Schools, and Jessica Hood, Director of Outreach and Public Relations in Wise County and the City of Norton Commonwealth's Attorney's Office. Respectful of the time that is a little bit limited today, I just want to share some good news before we get into the detail. First, VRS continues to be in a very, very solid position and growing. We are now ranked as the 14th largest public or private pension fund in the U.S. I think last year we were 17th. And the 42nd largest in the world, serving almost 800,000 active and inactive members, retirees, and beneficiaries. Our assets continue to exceed $100 billion. The annualized return on our trust fund portfolio at the 10-year mark as of March 31st is 7.9%. And I think that is reflective of managing risk and capitalizing on certain growth opportunities, even in, as noted, recent uncertain economic times. Second, and I know Jamie touched on this, your unwavering commitment and timely action have greatly contributed, especially over the last 12 to 18 months, to the overall health of the system. Committing $1 billion within the 2022 Appropriation Act has reduced unfunded liabilities. As Jamie noted, those investments will save the Commonwealth an estimated $2 billion over the next 20 years. In addition, your recent decision to maintain the VR Board certified rates for the state and teacher plans, they lower VRS's unfunded liability by more than $415 million over 2 years. These actions contribute not only to the overall health of the retirement plans, but also assist in maintaining Virginia's bond rating. Last year, I was proud to announce the hiring of Andrew Junkin as Chief Investment Officer. Since becoming CIO in January, Andrews has demonstrated his commitment to Virginia public servants and has very capably managed the trust fund to meet its objectives as established by the board. Even in uncertain times, the retirement system continues to deliver on its mission, and we appreciate our partnership with you in meeting our commitment to the Commonwealth's public servants. Now Andrew will provide an investment program update, followed by VRS Director Trish Bishop, who will provide an administrative brief.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews, and I also want to thank you for your service. I know it's a huge responsibility and a lot of time, and it's very much appreciated.
Well, anybody I come into contact with I say it's a gift to be able to work with the team at VRS, and it is an organization that I think all of y'all should, based on my assessment, should feel very comfortable it is run with deep professionalism and integrity.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. I know you all have already had a busy day, and so I have a number of slides, and I promise I will only focus on 4 things today, 4 important things: returns, risk, our new asset allocation, and costs. So if we could go to page 9, please, the next slide. One more. Thank you. So this graph represents the fiscal year performance versus our target return, the light green line there, which is currently 6.75%. So our goal is to meet that return over the long term. You can see it's a challenging benchmark on a yearly basis because the markets are, as was mentioned several times, quite volatile, move up and down quite a bit. So we're going to look at the next slide, which is, I think, a better benchmark and provides some longer-term returns here. And in particular, if you focus on anything longer than the 1-year return, you'll see positive returns, the 3, the 5, the 10-year returns all above 675, and all of the returns are ahead of the benchmark. This is at the total portfolio level. So that's great news. We'll move on to page 14, just a few pages ahead. So that's the, one more, please. Thank you. So that's the return story on a couple of slides. This is a risk versus return slide. So the center of this graph is the median return and median risk of similar public plan investors. So you'd like to be up and left from that point, which would indicate that you've had higher returns and less volatility. And that's exactly where VRS is over these this 5-year period ending March 31st, 2023. And in fact, we're up and left, indicating, again, higher returns and less risk compared to our own benchmark. So solid returns and good risk management. Next slide, please. Focusing now on the changes in the asset allocation. This was just approved at the June board meeting after a comprehensive study that took months to complete, evaluating the assets of the plan versus the liabilities, the projected benefit payments. You can see we've slightly modified the target allocation with some reductions in public equity, increases in fixed income. The net result of all of this, I think if you drop down to the expected annualized return number and the expected annualized volatility number, those are really the things to focus on. So we've managed to, with these changes, maintain the same expected return for the total portfolio over the very long-term period. This is really a 20-year forecast. And we've managed to reduce the volatility associated with those returns. So we've essentially increased the diversification of the portfolio.
As a question.
Yes, sir.
I found with some help, where you are on your fixed income. On the JLARC report, it was page 14. You probably don't have access to it. But it says under fixed income that over the last 10 years, you have a benchmark of you're hoping to get a return of 1.4%. And of course, we ended up getting 2.1. But why would you allocate 15, 16% of our assets in something that you don't expect a return of but 1.4%?
Yeah, so, sorry, I just kicked something on my side of the table. I wanted to make sure it wasn't important. Investment grade fixed income, another word for that is just bonds, right? So we're trying to create a risk and return profile for the total fund that helps us earn that 6.75% or better at the total fund level, not asset class by asset class, but also create a balanced risk profile that avoids large drawdowns, which we're particularly sensitive to, like most investors, like VRS, are. So really, fixed income is in the portfolio, as it plays a different role. It provides cash flow in terms of the interest payments that we own from holding a portfolio of bonds, and risk mitigation from equity drawdowns. We own stocks, obviously, to provide higher returns over the long term than bonds. So the bonds are there as a risk mitigant.
I understand what you're saying. You know, I understand with risk comes reward, but with risk comes liability also. But, you know, if we're trying to get some fairly good returns, you know, I don't know if I would be, I wish you would look at either the 1.5% benchmark or the allocation of resources, because I believe up there you even allocated another 1% or 2% towards the fixed income. So you're allocating more money to the 1.4% benchmark. That's not a real good rate of return compared to what else you've done.
I would just point out that the 1.4% is what has happened, but as interest rates have moved up, as the Federal Reserve has increased rates to fight inflation over the past year plus now, year and say 4 months, the current return expectation for fixed income is closer to 5.5%. I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but the yield on the 10-year Treasury bond right now is above 4%, and that is kind of the minimum expectation that we'd expect to earn over the next 10 years in fixed income. We own a diversified portfolio of fixed income, which include investment-grade corporate bonds and other things like mortgages and on both commercial properties and residential properties, and those earn incremental returns above Treasury. So I would say that we're really expecting something like 5.5% from fixed income over the next 10 years.
Well, I won't belabor the point. I appreciate it, but I see over the last 10 years it's done 2%.
Yeah. Prepared to move on? Okay. Let's go to page 18. And this is my my final point of the 4 that I said I'd talk about. The bottom 2 graphs here really reflect that we are managing costs well. So the graph on the left shows that we are saving money versus other similar sized investors in terms of the fees that we pay to external managers. And then the graph on the right shows that by managing much of the money of the trust fund internally, we're saving additional fees there. So really, we've generated good returns. We've done it with lower risk than our benchmark, lower risk than our peers, and we've done it with by spending less money in fees, which is more money to retain in the trust fund. So hopefully that gives a good overview of the investments of the trust fund. I'm happy to answer any questions, or I'm happy to turn it over to Trish.
Questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I'm Trish Bishop, Director here at VRS. Jamie had asked me to talk a little bit about the legislative changes that went into effect in July 1 related to return to work. He mentioned them briefly during his remarks, but there are 2, I think, important things to note. First, that the break in service that's required for a retiree who is drawing their benefit to return to work in a full-time capacity was reduced from 12 months to 6 months. In addition, there were several specialized student support positions that were added to the return to work positions. And then also what was added was that employer contributions will be required for those folks who are in the return to work program. And that serves really to help mitigate the impacts to the plan on those folks who are drawing their benefit sooner than otherwise. Our return to work program really is designed to sort of help protect the fund, but also try to address employer needs. And one thing I think that sometimes gets missed is that there is significant flexibility within the current rules that we have regarding return to work. In fact, folks can return at a schedule of 80% of a full-time equivalent position while also continuing to receive their benefit after a 1-month break in service. But also, folks can return under these critical shortage positions that are designated by the Department of Education, and retired law enforcement officers can return to work full-time as school security officers and continue to receive their benefit. I think we really try to be cognizant of our employer needs, but we also have that responsibility as fiduciaries of the fund, and also to ensure compliance with state code as well as the Internal Revenue Code. And so when folks are returning to work on a full-time basis, what that does is it can change retirement patterns, and so that they would, essentially the plan would be paying them sooner than we anticipate for a longer period of time without the benefit of time to gain those investment earnings to fund the benefits we pay. And I think I've mentioned to this group before, about 2/3 of benefits are funded by investment income. So if we do have to pay them sooner and for longer periods of time, that can have an impact. We've continued to look at return to work quite a bit. In 2022, we did a report. We have 2 more reports that are on the horizon that'll be delivered later this year. Just wanted to touch on membership. We know that there are almost 800,000 folks that we serve, but the hybrid is now the plan that most new members go into. And just as a reminder, the hybrid retirement plan combines elements of a public pension plan and a defined contribution plan. And the way that plan was established essentially reduces benefit costs compared to Plan 1 and Plan 2 for the employer, but also lowers risk because the longevity and investment risk is shared with the employer and the employee. Another one point to note here is on the hybrid retirement plan, employees who are in hazardous duty positions, police, firefighters, EMS, they do not go into the hybrid plan. Generally speaking, they remain in Plan 2 if they're new entrants. Wanted to talk a little bit about benchmarking. You heard a lot about that this morning and throughout the various comments that are made this morning. But we use cost effectiveness benchmarking service to compare us to our other pension plan peers. And CEM does a very robust analysis and looks at how we are doing in terms of not only the efficiency of how we deliver service and cost and how we do that. And we are pleased to share that once again, CEM's analysis has put us in the upper left quadrant, which is the desirable quadrant, where we are providing high service at a lower cost relative to our peers. As Chairman Andrews noted and has been said and also noted by Jamie, we really rely on you as our partner, and we are gratified by the significant efforts that the legislature has committed to supporting VRS. Those significant cash infusion, as Jamie mentioned, are creating $2 billion in savings over the next 20 years, maintaining the board-certified rates over the biennium. We estimate about $548 million in savings over the next 15 years as a result of that effort. We are at approximately, as of last June 30th, we're in the process of starting our next valuation cycle, but we were at about 83.4% funded on a market value basis for our pension plans. And that's a good news story. However, as you know, legacy unfunded liabilities remain. There's still about $19 billion on the pension side in unfunded liabilities. So as we think about plan design changes or benefit enhancements, I think that's a figure where we should all keep that top of mind. So in summary, the hybrid retirement plan, which went into effect in 2014, has served to reduce employer benefit costs and risk. However, there are some opportunities with that to enhance that plan in order to improve outcomes for our members. Things like auto escalation or accelerating the auto enrollment or accelerating auto escalation for voluntary contributions might help. We do offer significant flexibility with return to work, but we will continue to do some work with those additional studies that will come out later this year. And I think it's important to note that the cash infusions and contributions you have made have helped to decrease unfunded liabilities, moderate contribution rates, produce future savings, and improve overall plan health. We are always honored to serve Virginia's public employees, and it's really our pleasure to help our members plan for tomorrow today. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Are there questions? Thank you. You seem to give good news reports. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Madam Chair, that concludes our agenda for today. Our next meeting is scheduled for Monday, September 11th at 10 a.m. We don't know the location yet. On the agenda will be our review of the teacher pipeline, as well as our review of economic development incentives for location and expansion. One other meeting note, we have now nailed down a meeting time and date for our November meeting, and I'll follow up with an email about this. Our meeting now is scheduled for Monday, November 13th, and we'll be doing it at 1 p.m. due to a morning conflict that Monday. Thank you for your attention today, and enjoy the rest of your summer.
Thank you. Thank you all.